had real problems trying to keep its member countries together, and there's always the looming issues of either a Greek exit or maybe even a default on Spanish bonds. China's recently seen a slump in its manufacturing output. There's really only been Asia and, of course, Australia, who seem to have escaped relatively unscathed. But even so, it's clear that there is a major change in the global economic power base going on, and the implications for Australia could be profound. Professor Anne Kruger is a former chief economist of the World Bank and was also with the International Monetary Fund until 2006. She's here in Sydney to give her analysis of the Eurozone crisis and the implications for Asia and Australia. So, Anne, thank you very much for joining me today. Was I being too pessimistic there in my introduction?
Well, I think it's not a question of pessimism so much as it's just a very great deal of uncertainty as to how it will resolve, and until we have some notion as to the outcome, people can imagine things, I'm sure, that are far worse than probably the worst possible outcome, and I think there's a concern there.
And yet it seems that this crisis has gone on for several years, where people have talked about maybe coming to a solution, and it's almost like people standing around a swimming pool while somebody's drowning in the middle of it, but not actually coming to a solution.
Well, I think that's perhaps a little too strong. It's been too little too late, that each time the Europeans in particular have looked at the situation and decided to take action, they've taken action that might have been okay 6 months ago, but the thing has gotten more serious since then. And also, I think at the beginning, people did not realize exactly the depth of the problems that were there.
So what should they be doing?
Well, they need somehow to resolve three issues which are interrelated. On the one hand, they need to get the Greeks to restore some kind of public order in their public finances, and that the Greeks have made some progress, but they started in a very deep hole. Number two, they've probably got to do more than they've done so far on the issue of outstanding debt, because there's a lot of that, and that's in the banking system, both in Greece and in the rest of Europe, and that's a major problem. But in order to have any long-term solution, the third thing they have to do is to get some economic growth, and that takes structural reforms. And on that score, so far, the Greeks have not done terribly well.
And yet, if you look at how the world economies have been reacting to the European crisis, most of them have been fairly resilient. Certainly Chinese manufacturing was keeping up strongly until fairly recently. Even the Asian financial market didn't seem to be too badly affected. Could the thing actually explode so we end up with a global financial crisis Mark II that's far worse?
I think it's unlikely, but of course you can never say never in these kinds of unknowns going forward, and it's certainly, I suppose, imaginable that there could be some kind of geopolitical event or something somewhere that would then trigger the worst going around. But I don't think that's likely. The worrisome outcome, I think, the most worrisome outcome is simply that there is enough delay in trying to reach decisions and in getting effective decision by all 17, and then getting the agreement of the ECB and the IMF and so on, that at some point along the way, for whatever set of reasons that I can imagine several, the Greeks feel they are forced to take their independent action and on some weekend close the markets, announce a new drachma, and go their way.
So what will be the role of the IMF in this? Can the IMF try and help the situation?
Well, the IMF already is in there. The IMF was not in there from the beginning because the Europeans thought they could handle it, but the IMF was brought in before the first program, and they refer to it as a troika with the IMF, the ECB, and the Eurozone countries. And the IMF has been there ever since. The IMF has, I think, at this point said no more money because they don't have any more to put into there, and they're worried about who else they might have to help. But certainly the IMF is already there. There is an IMF program in place. The IMF has lent money, so that's been done.
But if the IMF were at least helping out in the past, is there a danger of moral hazard that other countries that may get into trouble may think, well, the IMF can come up with some money somewhere else and try and help us out?
I don't think so. I think the penalties that the Greeks have paid for getting in this mess are very, very strong. And nobody else wants to be in that situation. So I think that there's some really tough things the Greeks have to do. It is hard. The decision-making process on the other side, when you've got 17 countries that have to agree, plus the European Union, or the Eurozone as a whole, plus then the ECB, plus the IMF, it's just a very complicated and difficult situation.
And the history of world financial crises, it does seem to happen on a fairly regular basis. Look at the Asian financial crisis. Of course, that was started off by a run on the currencies, but even so, it spiraled out of control, and the IMF were asked to help out. But it still took a long time to actually solve those problems.
Well, I don't know how long it took. In the case of Korea, the authorities said they did not wish any help from the IMF until December. The IMF came in, I think, on December 3rd, and by the end of January, the thing had stabilized. That's not a terribly long time pass. I think the stabilization part is not hard. Getting the reforms so that you don't do it again is harder and takes time. But I think Korea was back on growing within about 7 or 8 months. It was very rapid when they downturn and come up again.
Yeah, but it hit Indonesia much harder, and if you look at the devaluation of their
Sure, but
currency,
Indonesia had major political problems and some major other problems that could not right away be addressed, which is why it took so long.
Looking back on the Asian financial crisis, could the IMF have done more? Could it have helped any more in that situation?
Well, so much of what has to be done has to be done by the country anyway. And many times the authorities aren't quite ready to accept that maybe they bear some responsibility for what happens. So I think the answer is that it's hard. Yes, the IMF possibly could have said, look, you guys have to take more actions, but I think there would have been enough of a pushback on the part of the authorities that they probably wouldn't have. So in that sense, I doubt it.
When the IMF was set up, of course, it was part of the Bretton Woods system. It was designed there to sort of be the additional lender, not quite of last resort, but at least to help out when necessary. But if you look at what happened in Argentina in 2002, at that point it was almost sort of the creditor knocking on the door. Did it go too far?
Well, what happened in Argentina, pure and simple, was that the Argentines adopted a quasi-currency board, which is very close to what the Greeks are in with regard to the euro area, and at the same time did not undertake the other measures that were necessary to sustain it, and then wanted to try and maintain what they could without doing the necessary steps. So they ended up with a big fiscal problem. In their case, it had to do with the provinces being able to issue basically money, which the federal government could not control.
So how do we then move on now in terms of Asia? Hopefully the European crisis is going to solve itself, and yet there are now questions as to whether this is now going to spill over. We've seen the slump in Chinese manufacturing over the past few months.
Yeah, well, I mean, the first thing to be said is that one way I like to put it is in the 19th century, the fastest growing country in the world over the century was Great Britain. It grew in per capita terms at 1.5% a year. The rapidly growing countries of Asia, in their rapid growth phase, South Korea, now China, have been growing that fast in a decade. But when you grow that rapidly, you confront problems much more quickly. The train is going so much faster that all these issues come up. And where Asian countries are at now, they are like the rest of us. We all have problems at our stages of development, and you either can confront them and address them and take action so that they're not the roadblock to the next part of development, or you hit a crisis. I guess I'm reasonably confident that we will see some countries in the world that once again, over some issue or other, fail to take the appropriate remedial actions before a crisis, and we'll see other crises. But I don't think that that's an argument for not growing.
Oh, certainly not. But maybe is it an argument finally for maybe a little bit more regulation? If countries do want to take part in the world stage, of saying to them, just don't borrow too much and try and keep a little bit more control.
The question is how much is too much. And that's not an easy one to answer, and also there are markets for it. Now, the big problem then, and I think what you're hitting at, is the extent to which when countries do borrow, to what extent is there any then support getting them out of there? And that's the harder question, but I'd be very reluctant to say you can't borrow more than so much. The Koreans, during their rapid growth phase, were borrowing 10% of GDP per year, and their debt to GDP ratio was going down because they were growing so fast. They used it all very productively, and if you borrow and you pay 7 or 8% on it, and you're getting a 30% rate of return as they were, what's the problem? So, I mean, it's good borrowing and bad borrowing, and sorting out which is hard.
So how can you actually analyze what is good and bad borrowing? Is there any easy test?
Well, some kind of test. If you're borrowing a lot and you're not getting any more output and growth is slow, then you've got a problem.
Well, in that case, I'm sure many countries are certainly going to be looking at the lessons we can learn from the global financial crisis.
Don't forget that we also want to distinguish between the cyclical phenomena, where everybody will borrow more in the or will spend more in the downturn, and then get more tax receipts in the upturn. So, the cyclical and the longer-term trend, and they are different.
They certainly are, but again, countries don't seem to always learn the lessons of that. They always just hope things will get better.
Yes, that does happen.